Hi, my name is Melvin Way. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is a plant growing series, the first episode about growing California goldenrod from seeds. These seeds have been incubated in 5 fistfuls of steam sterilized dirt on a heat mat, about 20 to 30 Celsius for 24 days. So the genus is Solidago, species is Californica, so that's the local California species of goldenrod. There are about 100 to 200 species, or 150 to 200, depending on which source you read, of goldenrod species native to North America. And they've gone across the world and have become invasive in some other places, which is rare because usually it's the old world species that come here and invade. So I'm doing some transplants on day 24. I have to be very gingerly about it, and it appears I've only got a few seedlings in that bag. I wish I had a lot more like I did with my Sweet Annie / Sweet Wormwood series. But that's not the case. And this is a perennial herb that forms codices or rhizomes. Not too sure what this species will end up looking like and what its root structure will be like. But I have 2 seedlings there that you can barely see, and yeah, I just knocked one over like that by the watering. But I think that's important if you do the gentle showering. This is a very gentle showering watering can, actually. And you knock it over, that means you didn't do the transplant right, and you've got to right the situation. Otherwise, it just wasn't meant to be, and it'll probably dry out and die, or get knocked over later and cause even more damage. So I have to be very gentle not to rip the root tips. It's a very high dexterity endeavor, so if you're not up for this, or you don't want to deal with such a delicate, fragile situation, then you might want to wait longer in the bag. So it's day 30. I'd recommend watering every 2 days from the top gently like this, not too deep. Leave some soil dry at the bottom to absorb water away. But basically you don't need to water deep because the roots don't go very deep. I'd be surprised if they were longer than a quarter of an inch, half an inch, past 1 or 2 centimeters. So it's been another 6 days, and this bag that's normally zipped up and sealed has been pre-unzipped by me for filming convenience only. It looks a little dry in there because of all the evaporation and condensation cycles, and I don't see any more seedlings, which is bad. I wanted more backups. It's day 38. Water cooler in the water closet got busted, and it resulted in a waterfall down my balcony. So the maintenance people fixed it, but the towel underneath between this heat mat and the concrete got soaked, and that removed the insulation, made the temperature go haywire. So I hope this thing's still alive, even though it suffered a temporary very hot heat wave up to 130 Fahrenheit essentially. So I've got one more. I'm going to do the transplant like this again, and these are very small despite the extra days. This one was just a late comer. I'm going to plant it between the 2 existing ones on the right side of this pot. But I hope everything's okay. We'll see later whether that grows and whether the heat wave had an effect on not only this one that I'm transplanting, but all the remaining seeds in the bag. Because there's a potential that once you go over, say, 40 Celsius, that you kill everything, basically. So I think 40 Celsius, what is that? That's like 104 Fahrenheit. That's very hot. And most seedlings or seeds won't tolerate that high of a temperature for an extended period of time. The many goldenrod species can be difficult to distinguish from each other due to their similar bright golden yellow flower heads that bloom in late summer. Propagation is by wind-disseminated seeds or by spreading underground rhizomes, which can form clonal colonies of the same plant. The young leaves are edible. I suppose you could use them as a spinach in a soup or to stir fry or whatever you want to do. And the Native Americans use the seeds of some species for food. Oftentimes I hear or read about people making teas out of them. So it's often confused with ragweed as the cause of hay fever in humans. That's not the case. People often mistake these. In some places, goldenrods are considered a sign of good luck or good fortune, but not really in North America, where it's very common. It's prized as a garden plant in Europe, Britain, etc. It's become invasive in some parts of the world, such as in China. So I'm using a relatively clean microfiber cloth to dab the water off of the foliage. At this point, I was still thinking about what some people said, if you have water droplets, it'll act as magnifying glass and fry your leaves in the direct sun. So it's day 40. They're a little bigger now. I have 2 viable specimens and one that just popped up like that. It's possible that in all these transplants, some of the seeds that were still dormant from the conditions in the bag just took a little longer to germinate. So I possibly have, like 4 or 5 of these things right now. And that's way better than just having 2 in case something goes wrong. Well, at this phase, I don't really think something's going to go terribly wrong. I mean, these are essentially weeds in the outside world, so they should do a lot better than some of the other plants. Typical garden plants or crop plants have been selected for by humans for many generations, for thousands of years or hundreds of years, so those are more vulnerable to pests and things like that. Although I wouldn't be surprised if some wild pests manage to find their way onto this balcony on the 3rd floor and infest this pot if they so desired. It's day 46. First few true leaves have become lobe-like, and there's nothing really special about these plants. They're just sort of weedy looking in appearance, although maybe not as weedy as Sweet Annie is currently looking. But they have leaves that are kind of a nice healthy green. You can see seedlings here and there, like that one. I have no idea where it came from, probably just a seed with a soil that germinated later. That middle one that we're just looking at, between the 2 biggest ones, that one isn't doing so well. Maybe it just needs more time to get established. And you can see a curled leaf coming out of the top like that. So it looks like some of the leaves of the main 2 are a little, not perfect, but whatever. As long as we keep getting growth and bigger leaves, the newer leaves will all be right. So sometimes you have defects in the beginning, but those leaves will be shed pretty quickly. If you have any sort of sense of perfection, you want all the leaves to be perfect looking and stay on forever, but that's just not the case. I mean, we're growing in some pretty ideal conditions, at least I think so, for some of these plants, and the early sets of leaves all get lost. Even if nothing really goes wrong, they just kind of wither away or decay. Maybe the plants just recycle the nutrients in them because they're just not big enough to really do anything for the plant, and they're low to the ground. They get covered by the foliage that comes out later. So the temperature range on this heat mat gets from 30 to 40 Celsius. That's 86 to 104 Fahrenheit. I'm going to examine this Solidago bag. Doesn't seem like anything's in there, despite all the extra days. It's been 22 days, I guess, of incubation. So here's the Solidago envelope, and it tells you what to do and characteristics of them. Harvest the leaves and flowers when buds form. That's the best time. So it's from Bountiful Gardens. I bought 3 different bags of seeds from them at the same time, and hence the 3 growing series started at the same time. The seeds are infinitesimal, just like with Sweet Annie, but they're darker, so they're easier to see. Although if those fell on the ground in the wild, you'd never be able to find them. Maybe a harvester ant could see them, but I certainly couldn't. I'd mistake it for dirt. So the dirt in the bag is a little dry due to evaporation, condensation cycles. As I said, the zipper is not completely waterproof as I once thought it would be. And I'm just doing a demo here. It's kind of ugly because I have to do this with one hand, which is nigh impossible. But later on I ripped open this bag and really gave it a good shake and brush off to get all the tiny seeds out and into the dirt. Then I used my gloved hand and mixed everything up manually, added some water, then mixed again. So to alleviate the dryness in there, I don't think it was dry or wanting for water in the beginning, maybe in the first 24 days, but after this many cycles of heating and drying, especially during the daytime heat, gets up past 100 Fahrenheit, I think just too much water ran out of the bag. So I did a lot of mixing after that just to see if anything would sprout afterwards, although I don't really need any, but it's day 58, and there's that one kind of at the bottom of the pot that I thought was a sweet Annie, but it's actually one of these. So this is one of my two bigger goldenrod plants. They grow very, very slow compared to the sweet Annie, and the leaves are noticeably bigger, but still there's nothing really special that I can tell that's about to happen. I have noticed in some leaves that the morphology looks like it could change, as with sweet Annie or the passion fruit vine. That's something I'm observing for the first time. Actually, you can see one of the biggest leaves that we're looking at here kind of looks like, it could develop some serration later on, or the later leaves could be serrated. But the new one that's coming out is all funneled like that and sort of wrinkly. So I don't know what's going on. Like, this thing has a wrinkled leaf at the top, and some of those are just anomalies, but if you compare that to the sweet Annie, it's really different. So that seedling, I think, could actually be one of the goldenrods too. And I'm just going to water again. So do this every 2 days, but later on I realized that the watering tray started to accumulate a little bit of water in it. So I've watered this thing very thoroughly, and the goldenrod actually doesn't have a problem, not to the extent that sweet Annie does, of sticking to the bottom, to the soil and the edges of the pot when you water like this. So that's basically it for my first episode of Growing California Goldenrod from seeds. Stay tuned to my YouTube channel for further episodes. Welcome back to my Growing California Goldenrod from Seed series. It's day 65. By now I've realized that trying to grow two species in one pot was a really bad idea. I should have tried to just grow this in a separate pot. It's growing much slower. It's getting swarmed out by the sweet Annie, and pretty soon it's going to be covered by the canopy. So we have these little seedlings. I don't think I'll be utilizing those. These two primary ones look very healthy, the first and second movers. These other ones kind of develop funny. They seem to have misshapen leaves, or they're just developing very slow. That's a sweet Annie seedling. So during my transplant operations, sowing seeds and whatnot, oftentimes I use the same gloves, and then soil plus ungerminated seeds get spread around, and that's why there's different species scattered around sometimes, germinating very late. But so far they're not like great looking or anything. They're just sort of California weedy looking, probably because I've seen them in the wild. In fact, I have, looking back at some pictures online, comparing them to what I saw in, I think it was Santa Isabel East Preserve. I saw a lot of beautiful flowers. I think it was late spring last year, and that turns out to be California goldenrod. So it can grow 1.5 meters tall with a hairy stem, according to the literature, unlike the non-hairy stems and petioles and branches, so to speak, of sweet Annie to the left of this pot, which can grow even taller. So I think maybe 1.5 meters is a short estimate. It can definitely go beyond 2. It's a very attractive plant when it's in bloom. So there's 2 more seedlings near the edge. I have a feeling I won't need them. This plant seems to be very robust despite its slow growth. It has rhizomes, but unlike the other things that I've grown in the past, such as ginger, ginseng, and whatnot, yerba mansa too, which I just published a series on 2 weeks ago, that'll have rhizomes. But typically I thought of rhizomes, plants that have them, as being just very fussy and slow growing and vulnerable, and that could still prove to be the case, but so far it hasn't. This has been resilient. The germination rate is not high. Maybe that's just because the conditions I used for all 3 species, sweet Annie, California goldenrod, and yerba mansa, just don't favor the latter 2. So I planted this too low in retrospect. At the time I was like, this is just perfect, but there was no stem to sort of position the whole thing perpendicularly by. And even if there was, sometimes, in the early stages the stem is very malleable according to phototropism and just bend wherever the sun goes. So you could plant something thinking it's at the perfect angle, and then it turns out not to be, and later on you'll decide whether to adjust or not. Typically it's just easier to spin the pot. So that wasn't too bad. As you can see, when I scooped this out from the pot, it had a root protruding underneath that fistful of soil. So I'm just going to do some watering and hope that this thing recovers. My gut instinct is it might take a while, at least a few days, if not longer. Sometimes for my Joshua tree transplant, after everything died from root rot, that one seedling just sat in a pot for months and nothing happened. So in most cases, wet leaves touching dirt equals rotten leaves later on. I don't know if that's going to be the case here. I tried to plant this somewhat on a tiny artificial hill of its own. It's somewhat elevated on a mound. I know it's hard to see from here, but to the eye it's very apparent when you're handling this. So sometimes I use a squirt bottle and hose down the leaves. It's day 79. As you can see, the sweet Annie plant, the main plant, got giant. I rooted everything out. So the backup specimen is doing particularly well for, considering how confined it is and its conditions. It's trying to grow out there and get away from the sweet Annie plant and get some sun. I pulled out the other sweet Annie plants prior to this, and there's not much growth here. I kind of expected that. After a transplant, you shift around all the soil contacting the roots. You break some roots, no doubt. So by all that shifting around, different areas that were contacting potting mix particles are no longer, and so forth, and you rip up all these like micro hairs on the roots and whatnot. You're just causing a lot of damage. So obviously you don't want to do that, but I had to. My plant is displaying phototropism. It's bending towards the sun because it only gets it from one angle every day. And I'm going to water again. It's on a slight elevation on a little mound compared to the rest of the soil. There's really no point in having everything on the perimeter of the potting mix be completely level, and this mimics probably a more natural environment, or maybe not. I think I saw this growing mostly on the bases of small mounds. So it's day 86. Scant difference has been noticed despite the passing of over a week, but it still looks very healthy. This is one of the few plants I've had that just seems to take whatever I throw at it. And I've switched the position of this pot. Not much is really going on. It's growing a lot slower. It does form a rhizome, or so I've read, and to me that kind of explains why it's growing a lot slower. This is a perennial. It's not an annual like sweet Annie. So the sweet Annie is huge. Just saw that to the very left, just a glimpse of it, and I keep watering. So far I've been using distilled water. I have a water distiller at home, but at some point with all these plant projects going on with the sweet Annie and the passion fruit vine taking up so much water, I just had to stop that. And I think it was late April, maybe early May 2017, I just had to stop and use tap water, which is fine if you're flushing out, just liters upon liters of water. So it's day 94. The leaves look bigger and more erect. I think the transplant recovery phase is over. So there's explosive growth now. Part of that could also be just due to me really saturating the potting mix with water. Whereas before I was just, doing the bare minimum to get by. So, this plant series, I know it's not very interesting so far, but eventually this thing should get pretty big and it should live for years, although I don't think I'm going to carry on this series for years. I'll probably just get it to the point where it's, relatively big and has rhizomes, and then I can dig that up and show that to you. So I switched the position. It's at a slightly lower elevation, and actually the passion fruit vine leaves are starting to block out some of the sun, but it still gets enough sun during the day. I read that it's suitable for strong shade or light shade, or sun without reflection. So probably don't want to have it next to any glass surfaces or reflectors, just out in the full sun, or in positions to get lots of sun during the day and have reflections. So that's pretty much it. I have this new concern that the leaves are getting too long and droopy, especially when I water them. It's day 99, so as you can see, it's much longer now. And when I water, some of the bottom ones can touch the soil and get wet. And usually that forebodes rotting foliage, but that hasn't been the case. As you can see here, there's some secondary growth coming out of the side. It's coming off a very low base. This thing doesn't really have a fuzzy stem like advertised, at least not yet. And it's been 99 days, so it's been a very long time. This thing is a slow grower, but I don't have many complaints because it's just very robust. How often do you grow a plant and not see any spots on the leaves? And despite the leaves getting longer and touching the soil when wet, everything looks really healthy. I'm sure there are natural predators that are just dying to get to this and eat it. But like the wild specimens I saw, that's pretty healthy, and it's gradually becoming more aesthetic, even though it just sort of resembles a weed that I see often in my hikes and probably just didn't know of in the past. It's day 107. So the leaves are much longer and droopier. Some of the tips are touching the pot, and when I water, there's no way I can go to each plant and just kind of use a towel and dab off the water. So I just leave the water there. The water droplets serving as magnification glasses and frying the plants. That hasn't really proven to be the case, despite me doing this on purpose and just leaving all these big water droplets there. And this plant doesn't seem to have much of an orientation anymore. It just kind of looks like a ground sprawling, ground creeping plant. It's taking up most of the pot like this, and I hope the leaves can just get long and big enough so they can go over the edges, and that way just not be lying on the surface of the soil when they're wet. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for episode 3. Alright, welcome back. It's day 114 of my California Goldenrod growing series. It's coming along nicely. It's a lot more perky. I've been watering more frequently. As you can see, the leaves have a bit of a fuzz, and they're very healthy looking. This is some amazing foliage. It is a wild sort of weed plant after all in Southern California and many other places around here, so it does very well on its own in just rain and of course no fertilization like I'm doing now. So it's day 121, a week later, and if you follow my gardening channel for the last year or so, you've probably noticed that I've been using Men's Health multivitamins crushed up. You can leave the chunks on the surface if you want, and that way when you water in the future it'll kind of disperse the nutrients over a temporal time frame rather than just all go in at once. So yeah, I'm just washing off the fertilizer and lifting up the leaves to make sure that there's no fertilizer burn, which is hard to avoid because the leaves mostly aren't long enough to exceed the radius of the pot. But day 137, 2 weeks later, 2.5 weeks, they are. So it's a good sign that everything's growing very nicely. To spin this around, it's always very hard for me to show what's going on in the watering tray, and you can see a root there. So like my other plants, it's starting to drink directly from the water that accumulates from any flow through directly, which means I can let the water tray just sit with a lot of water in it so the plant doesn't go thirsty. So it's got some stalks coming up, and they're fleshy and green. No signs of bark or anything. I think that's how it is in the wild for inflorescences, although I'm not sure whether these are inflorescences or just kind of fleshy funnels of leaves. You can see a little bit of a burn there from fertilizer burn, probably from the last time. So it's day 147, and the inflorescences are longer. I'm putting some more fertilizer in there. You can see a dead leaf there actually. The last episode I was saying there are no dead leaves. You can see another sort of burn at the end of a leaf there. The very original leaves that are now obscured in darkness underneath are now starting to die. I can show you a close-up later. But you can just see the foliage is fanned out everywhere. So if I water away from the center, water just starts raining over the sides because it travels along the leaves. And I'm feeling these stalks. They're very pleasant to the touch. They feel solid. They're not hollow funnels of leaves like with ginger, as I was saying, or trying to say earlier. The foliage looks very healthy. It branched out. All the bottom foliage now exceeds the rim of the pot, so I don't have to worry about it lying on wet soil and getting fertilizer burn, although there's been a very minimal amount of that. It's getting taller and my balcony is becoming overgrown with various plants. You can see the yerba mansa right over there. It has nowhere to go. It's a real lateral land colonizer. So I'm going to water again using tap water for this because I think it's perennial actually. It forms a rhizome unlike the sweet annie, but it has a lot more growth than some of the other plants, succulents, etc. So I'm mostly watering close to the center to avoid water spilling over the sides like you're seeing right now, and I'm just watering in those two spots to get the fertilizer dissolved, and hopefully these three stalks coming out from the center will grow like stalks of corn, and this thing will really flourish and give a really showy display of flowers very soon. So if you haven't already, please look for my Facebook page. Just search for Melvin Way YouTube channel and you'll find it, or you can search in for my name on Instagram. I have some short video clips and interesting pictures of local flora and fauna. You can see a dead leaf right there. So yeah, those aren't getting any sunlight. The plant can recycle the nutrients and the leaf litter will just add nutrients back to the soil. So yeah, look for me on social media and I'll be posting shorter updates like this in the future. Hi, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is Melvin Way speaking. I'm using a flashlight during the day to show you the roots in the watering tray. They look healthy enough, although they're not as thick as the watering tray roots for some of the other plants. For the past few weeks the watering tray was overflowing virtually. Sometimes I'd make a big mess when the water would overflow, and just in a quick span of maybe 10 days or so, that's a flashlight, I'm going to turn it off, all this leaf rot occurred. Well, it doesn't seem so much like a rot where there's mildew or anything. It's just they're all dying and the edges are all withering away, desiccating. So I don't really understand what's going on. There's 4 of these very healthy looking green fleshy stalks that came up. I don't know if those are intended to become inflorescences later, but for now growth is stunted because everything's dying. I don't know if this is a disease that was caught due to overwatering or whatnot. You know, having lots of water in the watering tray and Miracle-Gro fertilizer has been a very winning formula for my other 5-plant series. So I can't tell whether this is something I did or it's something that's out of my control. I can't always show success stories, but luckily this series has the least interest out of the 6 that are currently going. So if you know what's going on or you have a theory, please post on my YouTube comments or just go to my Facebook page, like the page. It's called Melvin Way's YouTube channel, and post in the comments there. So it's just been a fun experiment, although I would really like to see this plant recover and someday flower, which shouldn't be too soon, maybe within a few weeks or months. So thanks for watching, and please stay tuned to see if this plant stays alive or not. Alright, it's day 167 of this Growing California Goldenrod from Seed series. I'm illuminating the watering tray with my flashlight. It has that wavy effect because of the low frequency of the light, or perhaps the camera. I don't know if those roots are desiccated or dead. It's possible that because the watering tray has been dry for so long that those roots are just dried out and waiting to be reactivated whenever essentially this synthetic water table gets created by a pool of water down there. So there's been a lot of damage. You can see all these dead leaves. I haven't touched anything. I haven't trimmed them for aesthetics. And it starts from the bottom up. It's not any communicable disease or sort of pestilence caused by insects or other things like mites, as far as I can tell. And you can see there's new growth here. I think that's inflorescence, well, the tip of it. Flower primordia waiting to burst forth for a showy display. And of course that's the tallest one. This is third tallest, second tallest. So these three were the original inflorescences that I saw coming forth. And then there's a fourth one where you can see in the background. It's not as tall, but it's begun to recover. And there's been a fair bit of phototropism. As you can see, everything's leaning towards outside the balcony. So this plant, California Goldenrod, definitely doesn't shy away from full sun like my passion fruit vine, which keeps trying to come inwards, and other things as well. So yeah, that's been a great recovery, and I don't think the fertilizer has been an issue, but just in case it was, I didn't add any more, and I've only watered twice sparingly since then, including this one time, and I made sure I didn't water to the point at which water was just pouring forth into the watering tray and just sitting there for days or even weeks. I'm pretty sure this plant isn't ready for that yet. So it probably has developed a rhizome already and a pretty healthy root system. And with this recovery, as long as I don't blow things, it should be on its way to flowering soon. And that hummingbird that keeps coming by should be very happy. It's been investigating for quite a while, and it's been waiting for flowers. So thanks for watching, and please stay tuned. Alright, it's day 169. I'm going to apply some Miracle Grow Flower Boost. It's a fertilizer that looks the exact same, but it has different macronutrient composition to favor plants that are in their flowering stage and support more flowers, more blooms, more showy display of flowers, etc. So I'm sprinkling this medium in, and it necessitates a lot of watering, which I said maybe an episode or two ago that I wouldn't do because this plant was recovering from root rot. So I'm just going to water the necessary amount to hydrate these crystals and get it all dissolved and into the potting mix. But I think the root rot phase has largely passed, and I'm sure if I watered too much again to the point where the watering tray was full for days or weeks, the rest of the plant would rot away. So I don't think this is some kind of plant pathogen or disease. It's just due to the soil being too waterlogged, and those roots at the bottom in the watering tray, which I showed you, didn't look too hot after I let it dry out from the last few weeks. So I'm still anticipating a big showy display of flowers. I'm sure the local hummingbird is very excited, and this will probably be the last time I water for quite a while. It's day 173. I'm still waiting on the flowers. The soil has stayed relatively well hydrated. The top layer of potting mix isn't dry looking at any point. It takes a long time to dry out. I guess the plant's water usage is very low despite all the foliage. There used to be a lot more foliage too. So this flowering structure at the top of what I've been calling an inflorescence, this entire stalk, has elongated. It flops around from day to day, day to night, and sometimes it's facing forward. It'll curl and sort of keel over. Other times it'll reverse course. So sometimes when I look at this plant, I'm thinking the worst has happened and the flower primordia are going to croak. The whole plant's going to die. But it's been like this for a few days, and the flowering structure is getting more and more well developed. It's day 176 now in the footage you're looking at. You can see all these nuances, new leaves, tiny leaves and flower buds popping out. directly beneath that big structure. These other two inflorescences, if you can call them that, are not doing too hot. There's a little bit of curl on those top leaves, which makes me think that maybe there is a comeback case of root rot. This fourth one, this fourth stalk, is kind of on pause. I don't know what's going on there. So let me know if you think I should do some pruning and get rid of all this dead foliage. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's day 186 of this Growing California Goldenrod from Seed series. I don't know why it took me so long to figure out the simple trick of using handheld mirror to reflect natural light into the watering tray or other dark spaces. In the past I would just try to focus endlessly and it would never take. So you can see those desiccated roots. I doubt they would recover and become supple again or active if I were to overwater to the point at which the bottom watering tray was full again. It's been empty for weeks, and you can see how parched the soil is in between all of these leaves that I put there on top as compost that I purged and pruned from these 4 inflorescences. All the bottom foliage is gone. You can see this one is starting to grow again. It has new leaf activity, new leaves being generated, just like for the top 2 on the right here. It looked like they were going to be gone and wither away and die. So a lot of the foliage has died. And this one has flower primordia as well as the one that I've been filming and showing in the thumbnail pictures. This is the biggest and the best. It has these yellow flower primordia, and while I was filming the passion fruit vine series update that's concurrent with this one, a hummingbird came right in front of this and just paused, and when I turned to look at it, it flew away. That's what it always does. It comes to investigate every day, probably multiple times a day. They fly very fast and they patrol the entire apartment complex, in my opinion, for anything that's flowering. And I think it might be the same one. It's marked this balcony as its territory. So hummingbirds do get territorial, and they do fight and chase each other off because they have such high caloric needs for sugar water that they need every flower they can get to themselves. I'm just going to water like that and not too much. Hopefully we'll get a big show soon. Thanks for watching. It's day 195 of this Growing California Goldenrod from Seed series. I have 2 new shoots funneling out from the center mass where I supposedly have rhizomes underneath. And that brings a total number of inflorescences to 6. This is a totally different mode of growth from the early on beginning phases of this plant series where everything was spreading out radially, just randomly in 360 degrees as ground creeping plant. Ever since it had plans to flower, everything changed, and this longest, oldest inflorescence is very top heavy. It depends on the rail to support itself. So I don't know if it's like this in nature in the wild. I don't think so, but I did something wrong somewhere along the way, or this just doesn't deal with having sun just coming in one direction every day, as well as its native wild cousins. So I saw a honeybee collecting some pollen and nectar here. I haven't caught any other pollinators in the act, although I did see a hummingbird that used to visit my balcony every day. No longer seems to do, at least not while I'm out there. It hovered in front of that batch of flowers. So it's day 204. I decided to finally end this series. The inflorescences, the 3 main ones and oldest ones, are longer than a meter. This middle one, the 3rd longest one, is branching out in all different directions. I'm sure that would have resulted in a different kind of growth. It didn't happen with the other 2. They just went ahead and flowered. So I have this beautiful bouquet of flowers. You could see at the tip for the very first inflorescence on the left, some of the flowers are finally dying. They've been in bloom for weeks, so that's why I was saying this is similar to orchids in that respect. These flowers are hard to capture the detail on in bright daylight like this because it's just a bright, blinding yellow that saturates everything. So I'll be sad to see this go, but this plant series was not popular in the least, unfortunately. And I have interest in all sorts of local plants. Unfortunately, the general public doesn't. So this third one, it's branching out. I'm sure it would have ended up like this first and second inflorescence, but it would have been much more spectacular in its blooms. Meanwhile, I lost a lot of foliage on that first one, and now I'm going to do the digging to show you the root system. So based on the droopiness of these inflorescences, I expected these to just break off. But when I pulled, I was very surprised that they're very, very tough. And they're sort of like a flexible bamboo in terms of toughness. So it seems like California goldenrod is very intolerant of wet soil. I tried to keep the soil mass, the root ball, dry for as long as I could, but then the top would look dry from being struck by the sun every day, and I would water, and I experienced a comeback in this plant midway through the series, so I figured why not water a little bit more. Maybe that's what's preventing these 3 main or 4 inflorescences from standing up straight, or at least having some kind of structure so that they're not reliant on the balcony rail. And even with the balcony rail, they were basically drooping over that too. So it was a rather unhealthy, cumbersome situation, and I detected no rhizomes. I am seemingly terrible at growing rhizomes. Every plant that is said to have a rhizome, even ginger, I couldn't really increase its rhizome mass that much. I think the common thread is I water too much, I overwater, and potting mix is very hygroscopic. It holds on to water very well, so everything just doesn't do well. Sometimes get leaf rot, root rot. So that's it. You can see some of the roots are a little bit more green or yellow. I think that's because as the root ball sucked all the water out of the soil, then it kind of cracked away from the pot, so light could get in at certain angles, and that's what caused the greening of some of the roots. This 4th inflorescence was just awful and unproductive. So thank you for watching this California goldenrod growing series. I'm going to continue to steer my channel in a more productive direction, which has already begun with my mango growing series. And I'm going to take one of my viewer suggestions and regrow avocado, which I did in 2016. I think that'll be a hit if I can get it to grow faster.